My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I just turned 32. I was incredibly excited to celebrate my father's 65th birthday at the Summit Room, the most exclusive restaurant in Chicago. My brothers and sisters had always been obsessed with status and success. While I chose a different path, they had no idea that for years I had been hiding my true career from them. My simple blouse and modest jewelry were meant to create an unexpected contrast with their designer outfits. Before I tell you what happened that evening, let me know in the comments what city you are watching from. If you enjoy stories about standing up for yourself, hit the like button and subscribe so you do not miss real-life stories that might inspire you. I grew up in a family that you could call upper middle class. But as the years went by, my family became increasingly consumed by appearances and social standing. My father, Robert Mitchell, was the epitome of a self-made man. He started with absolutely nothing. He was the son of a Detroit auto worker and a diner waitress, and he built a highly successful commercial real estate company through pure grit and countless 16-hour workdays. My mother, Patricia Mitchell, came from a similar blue-collar background, but you would never guess it by looking at her behavior today. As soon as my father's business took off, she transformed into a quintessential country club socialite, carefully cultivating connections with the right people and obsessively managing our family's public image. And then there are my siblings. My older sister, Jessica Mitchell, was the golden child from day one. She graduated from Harvard Law School with honors and quickly landed a job at one of the most prestigious corporate law firms in New York City, Harrison, Sterling, and Brooks. Jessica never missed a chance to remind everyone of her achievements. She would drop the name of her Ivy League alma mater into conversations where it made no sense and showed off her designer wardrobe as if it were a requirement of her job description. My brother, Michael Mitchell, followed a similar trajectory. He became a plastic surgeon and runs a lucrative practice catering to wealthy clients and minor celebrities in Beverly Hills. Michael might have been even more arrogant than Jessica, constantly bragging about his latest imported sports car or showing off pictures from luxury vacations in exotic locations. He measured his own worth exclusively by his material possessions and the envy they inspired in others. I was different. While they were extroverted and obsessed with status, I was more introspective and driven by personal values. I loved to read, build things with my own hands, and ask questions about why the world worked the way it did. From a young age, this difference caused tension. My mother would often tell me to look at Jessica, asking why I could not be more like my sister, pointing out her perfect grades and the affluent circles she ran in. Despite my different nature, I initially tried to follow the path my parents laid out for me. I dutifully earned a business degree from a solid state university, though it was not an Ivy League school, which marked my first major disappointment in their eyes. After graduation, I took a job at a massive financial corporation, following the expected family trajectory. But 2 years in, I was miserable. The work felt meaningless. The corporate politics were suffocating, and I simply could not see myself doing this for the next 40 years, so I quit. That decision marked the moment my family officially labeled me a failure. When I broke the news, my mother practically mourned my future, asking what on earth they were going to tell their friends. My father, who had been my biggest supporter when I was a little girl, just looked deeply disappointed. He did not say much, but his silence spoke volumes. What my family did not know, and what I intentionally kept hidden, was my next move. While they assumed I had taken a job as an assistant manager at a local independent bookstore in a quiet neighborhood, a job they considered humiliatingly beneath our family, I was actually pouring my savings and my soul into building an educational technology startup called Learning Bridge. My company developed affordable, innovative software for underfunded public schools and students who might otherwise be left behind by the digital divide. I still remember the last big family gathering before my father's birthday. It was Christmas, and we were all at my parents' suburban estate opening gifts. My mother gave a tight smile as she unwrapped the cashmere scarf I had bought her, calling it thoughtful, and remarking that it must have been quite expensive for me given my financial situation. Jessica scoffed, stating it was probably a whole month's salary from that little bookstore. I tried to keep my tone even, and replied that some people find fulfillment in helping others rather than just making a profit. Michael snorted, calling my mindset a classic rationalization for people who do not know how to make real money. My father just watched the exchange in silence, occasionally glancing at his expensive watch as if he had somewhere much more important to be. None of them knew that my company had just closed a massive Series B funding round, valuing Learning Bridge at over $80 million. The modest bookstore job was just a cover, a way to stay connected to the literature I loved while I ran my tech empire behind the scenes. I lived in a cozy but unremarkable apartment, drove a reliable but incredibly basic sedan, and maintained a lifestyle that gave away absolutely zero clues about my actual success. Why did I hide my achievements from my family? Part of it was a test. I wanted to see if they could love and respect me for who I am, rather than what I had accomplished or bought. I craved a genuine connection based on something deeper than a tax bracket, but another part of it was self-preservation. I had watched money and success completely change my parents and my siblings, and I did not want that toxic dynamic infecting my own life. My relationship with my father was especially complicated. We were incredibly close when I was a kid. He used to take me fishing on Saturday mornings, just the two of us, and he would tell me stories about growing up poor and the hard lessons he learned along the way. But as his business expanded and our family's social ambitions grew, he became distant, fixated on appearances and high society networking. The man who once told me that character mattered more than cash now seemed to judge everyone, including his own children, entirely by their financial portfolios and social standing. 3 months before his birthday, my father suffered a mild heart attack. He recovered quickly, but the event shook me to my core. Despite our strained relationship, I loved him deeply and was not ready to lose him. I decided to make a real effort to reconnect, starting with his upcoming birthday dinner. I could never have imagined how that evening would unfold. The morning of my father's birthday arrived with a mix of eager anticipation and heavy anxiety. I stood in front of my closet, carefully deciding what to wear. I could have finally revealed the truth about my wealth by showing up in a designer gown that my brother and sister would immediately recognize as a 5-figure outfit. I admit, a small part of me wanted that petty satisfaction, but doing that would have completely ruined the point of keeping my success a secret all these years. Instead, I chose a simple black dress. It was well-tailored and elegant, but it did not scream wealth to people who obsessively track status symbols like my family does. I paired it with minimal jewelry, wearing small pearl earrings that belonged to my grandmother, and a delicate silver bracelet. Looking in the mirror, I appeared polished and appropriate for fine dining, but absolutely nothing about me announced that I was a highly successful CEO. As I was applying my lipstick, my phone rang. It was my best friend, Emily, whom I had known since college. She was one of the very few people who knew the truth about my tech company and my messy family dynamic. She asked if I was ready for the big performance, and I sighed, admitting I was as ready as I would ever be. I confessed that part of me was tempted to just tell them the truth and end the charade. Emily told me it had always felt strange to her that I kept the secret for so long, but she understood my reasoning. She reminded me that no matter what happened that night, I had absolutely nothing to prove to them. She pointed out that I had built something incredible, a company that was not just financially massive but was actually changing children's lives for the better. I smiled, deeply grateful for her grounded support. I remembered that at my father's birthday the previous year, Michael had spent 20 uninterrupted minutes talking about a nose job he performed on a reality television star, and Jessica had interrupted him only to boast about making senior partner. Neither of them had asked me a single question about my life. Emily suggested that maybe this year would be different, though I could hear the exact same doubt in her voice that I felt in my gut. After we hung up, I wrapped my father's gift. It was a pristine first edition of his favorite Ernest Hemingway novel, a book that took me months of networking with rare book dealers to track down. It cost far more than most people would ever spend on a birthday gift, but I knew my family would view it as a cheap, quaint present from the poor sister compared to whatever flashy luxury items my siblings were bringing. The Summit Room was located right in the heart of downtown Chicago, occupying the entire top floor of one of the city's most iconic skyscrapers. I had been there dozens of times, usually treating potential investors or school district superintendents to dinner on behalf of my company. The combination of sweeping skyline views, flawless service, and a celebrity chef made it the absolute perfect place to impress high-level clients. That was exactly why it had been chosen for my father's milestone birthday. What my family did not know was that I was on a first-name basis with the entire restaurant staff. Learning Bridge had hosted several massive charity galas at the Summit Room, and I had built a warm, friendly relationship with the owner, Marcus, and his team. I arrived about 15 minutes before the reservation, wanting a quiet moment to gather my thoughts before facing the firing squad. As I stepped out of the private elevator into the restaurant's breathtaking marble lobby, the head hostess, Chloe, greeted me immediately. She smiled warmly and welcomed me back. I told her I was there for my father's birthday dinner under the Mitchell reservation. Chloe looked at her screen, confirmed the private dining room was ready, but then hesitated, looking genuinely confused. She said she had no idea it was a family event, and mentioned that Marcus would definitely want to know I was in the building. I lowered my voice and politely asked Chloe and the staff to please keep my identity and my success completely quiet for the evening. I explained that my family did not know about my company or my financial situation, and that it was a very long story. Chloe raised a perfectly groomed eyebrow but nodded professionally, assuring me they would be entirely discreet. I sat at the mahogany bar and ordered sparkling water, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows. The sprawling grid of Chicago lay below me, the city lights beginning to flicker to life as the sun set over Lake Michigan. The view always centered me, serving as a reminder that a massive world existed far beyond my family's exhausting drama. 20 minutes later, I spotted my family walking out of the elevator. My parents stepped out first. My mother was wearing an outrageously expensive gown and was practically dripping in diamonds. My father wore a custom-tailored suit, looking distinguished but incredibly tired. Right behind them were Jessica and her husband, looking like they had stepped out of a Wall Street lifestyle magazine. Michael was the last to emerge, loudly making a show of handing his valet ticket to a staff member, so everyone in the lobby would know he had driven his new imported sports car. I took a deep breath, grabbed my wrapped book, and walked over to greet them. I hugged my father, wished him a happy birthday, and handed him the Hemingway novel. He hugged me back, but his posture was stiff. He thanked me for coming, but his eyes were already scanning the room, his attention shifting to a group of his wealthy business partners who had also been invited to the dinner. My mother looked me up and down with a hypercritical glare. She leaned in and whispered, asking if I could not have put in a little more effort for my father's special day, remarking that my dress looked like it came from a suburban mall clearance rack. I forced a smile, and cheerfully told her it was great to see her too. Jessica leaned in to air kiss my cheek and whispered that even the waitstaff were dressed better than I was, begging me not to embarrass them in front of Dad's important friends. I just nodded and said, okay. Michael strutted over last, slapping my shoulder with the forced, overly loud joviality he reserved for people he considered his inferiors. He loudly joked that his baby sister was still rocking the extreme budget lifestyle. He told me that if I ever wanted some basic investment advice so I could afford decent clothes, my big brother was always there to help. I maintained my tight smile, already feeling the heavy, familiar cocktail of resentment and absolute exhaustion that came with every family gathering. My father was entirely absorbed in shaking hands with his real estate partners and barely paid me a second glance. I stood awkwardly on the perimeter, watching my family charm and dazzle the assembled millionaires, feeling exactly like the outsider I had always been. About 20 minutes into the cocktail hour, the maitre d' approached our group. He addressed my father, letting him know the private dining suite was ready, and asking the party to follow him. My family and about a dozen business associates moved as a herd toward the back of the restaurant. I trailed behind them, clutching my small purse. Overwhelmed by the deeply familiar sensation of being an afterthought, the family member invited purely out of grim obligation rather than actual love. As we neared the heavy oak doors of the private dining room, Jessica suddenly stopped, turned around, and pulled me aside. Her manicured hand gripped my arm just a little too tightly. She kept her voice low but made sure she was just loud enough for the people walking past us to hear. She asked me if I honestly thought I was dressed appropriately for a place like the Summit Room. I looked down at my simple black dress and told her I looked perfectly fine, reminding her that this was a birthday dinner, not a high-fashion runway show. Her expression hardened instantly. She coldly informed me that the dinner cost hundreds of dollars a plate, and she directly asked if I could even afford to chip in for the joint family gift. She smugly revealed that she and Michael had each thrown in $5,000 to buy Dad an exclusive golf trip to Pebble Beach. Before I could even process the ridiculous flex, Michael strolled over with a glass of expensive champagne in his hand. He asked what the holdup was since dinner was about to start. Jessica put on a mask of fake, exaggerated concern, telling Michael she was just worried that I might feel highly uncomfortable in such an upscale, intimidating environment, pointing out that the menus did not even have prices listed. Michael's face immediately shifted into a mask of pure condescension. He laughed and told Jessica not to worry, loudly announcing that he would happily cover his little sister's meal if her bank account could not handle it. He smirked and looked around the hallway, clearly making sure Dad's business partners had heard his grand display of charity. My mother, drawn by the bottleneck we had created in the hallway, walked over and demanded to know what was going on, noting that everyone was waiting on us. I told her it was nothing and tried to step around Jessica to get into the room. But my mother stepped in front of me. She lowered her voice and suggested that perhaps it would be best if I just waited in the lobby bar until dinner was over. She explicitly stated that there were very important investors present, and the focus needed to remain on my father, not on my appearance. She vaguely waved a heavily jeweled hand at my outfit. A massive wave of hot anger and deep humiliation crashed over me. I stared at her, asking in disbelief if she was seriously demanding I sit out my own father's birthday dinner because she was ashamed of my dress. Jessica rolled her eyes and told me to stop being so dramatic. She claimed they were actually doing me a favor, insisting I would just feel completely out of place and miserable sitting at a table full of highly successful, wealthy people. I tried to diffuse the escalating situation with a little humor, pointing out that eating a slice of birthday cake did not generally require a minimum net worth. Absolutely no one laughed. Instead, Jessica physically shifted her body to completely block the entrance to the private room. She sneered, explicitly stating that only successful people belonged in that room, and told me the restaurant was completely out of my league. Michael nodded in enthusiastic agreement, seriously suggesting I take an Uber back down to the street level and grab a burger at an Applebee's where I would fit in better. The two of them actually chuckled at the cruel joke. I was acutely aware that we were causing a massive scene. Wealthy patrons at nearby tables were turning around to stare at us. Even a few of my father's business partners had paused near the door, clearly witnessing the entire conflict. And my father? He stood just inside the room, chatting with a local politician, either entirely oblivious to the fact that his family was bullying his youngest daughter in the hallway, or actively choosing to ignore it. The public humiliation was infinitely worse than the cruel words themselves. I felt myself shrinking, feeling smaller and more worthless with every passing second. My chest tightened painfully, and for one terrifying second, I thought I was actually going to cry in front of them, the one thing I had strictly promised myself I would never, ever do again. I watched my mother actively pretend she did not know me when a woman from her country club walked by and looked at us curiously. I heard my mother nervously chuckle and mutter to the woman that someone must have just gotten lost looking for the restroom. The rejection hit me like a physical punch to the stomach. Despite a lifetime of evidence to the contrary, some small, pathetic part of my heart had genuinely hoped that underneath the horrific materialism and the endless social climbing, my family actually loved me for the person I was. Standing in that hallway, that hope felt incredibly stupid and utterly naive. A flood of painful childhood memories rushed through my mind, every single one of them foreshadowing this exact moment. I remembered being forced to sit at the folding kids' table at Thanksgiving, while Jessica and Michael were invited to sit with the adults in the formal dining room. I remembered graduating college with top honors, only to have my achievement entirely ignored because Michael had just bought a luxury condo. I remembered my parents introducing me to their wealthy friends simply as their other daughter, completely omitting my name or anything about me. I was so deeply buried in these toxic memories that I barely noticed a tall restaurant security guard approaching our group, clearly drawn by the commotion my siblings were causing. He asked in a firm, professional tone if there was a problem. Jessica turned to the guard and flashed her most practiced, charming corporate lawyer smile. She assured him there was no problem at all, claiming her sister was just leaving the premises. The incredibly smug look on her face said everything. She fully expected the guard to forcefully escort me to the elevator, dealing the ultimate, final humiliation by having me physically thrown out of our family event. Cold sweat broke out on my forehead. My hands were shaking slightly, and I gripped my small leather purse so tightly my knuckles turned white to hide the tremor. The moment stretched out endlessly. Every single second felt like an absolute eternity of agonizing shame. I saw Michael's incredibly satisfied smirk, my mother's actively averted gaze, and worst of all, the continued, deafening indifference of my father, whose back was still turned to the nightmare unfolding with his youngest child. The security guard looked directly at me. Instantly, his stern expression vanished, replaced by a look of shocked recognition. He stood up completely straight and gave me a deep, highly respectful nod. He called me Miss Mitchell, referred to me directly as Madam CEO, and announced loudly that my usual VIP table by the window was available if I preferred to sit there. Absolute total silence fell over the hallway. I could practically hear the gears violently grinding inside my family's heads as they desperately tried to process what the guard had just said. Before anyone could even open their mouths, Marcus, the general manager of the restaurant, came practically sprinting down the hallway looking terrified. He rushed straight up to me. He frantically apologized, stating they had absolutely no idea I would be joining my family that evening. and begged to know if everything was to my liking. His frantic, deferential tone made it undeniably clear to everyone present that I was a massively important VIP whose happiness was the restaurant's highest priority. Jessica's jaw literally dropped open. She stared at me, then at Marcus, her eyes wide with total bewilderment. Michael's arrogant smirk completely froze, his eyes narrowing as his brain short-circuited trying to understand the bizarre scene. The situation escalated to an entirely new level of surreal when Chef Julian marched out of the swinging kitchen doors wearing his pristine white chef's coat. He bypassed the billionaires in the room and walked directly up to our little group, beaming with joy. He shook my hand and loudly declared what an absolute honor it was to have me dining with them again. He proudly announced he had been perfecting the truffle risotto I loved so much and insisted on preparing a special off-menu batch exclusively for me and my family. My mother's face went through an incredible journey, shifting rapidly from deep embarrassment to sheer confusion, and finally landing on a look of intense, calculating greed in a matter of seconds. My father finally turned away from his conversation, noticing the massive crowd of staff surrounding me, and stared with genuine, unmasked shock. I calmly thanked Chef Julian, telling him the risotto sounded absolutely wonderful. At that exact moment, Marcus, the primary owner of the restaurant group, arrived, completing the parade of high-level staff coming to pay their respects. He addressed my completely stunned family, loudly declaring that if he had known Sarah Mitchell was coming, he would have shut down the entire private balcony just for us. He turned to my parents and praised me, announcing that I had hosted the restaurant's most successful charity gala the previous month, personally raising over $2 million to fund public school technology programs. I quietly interrupted Marcus, pointing out my parents and my siblings. Marcus looked highly confused. He looked at my father, then back at me, and openly stated that he thought I had said my real estate investments were entirely separate from my father's business when I purchased the skyscraper the previous year. The ultimate bomb had just been dropped. Not only did the elite staff know me as a regular customer and a highly successful tech CEO, but I actually owned the very building. The Summit Room was located in one of the most expensive and prestigious pieces of commercial real estate in all of Chicago. I stood perfectly still and watched the entire family power dynamic shatter and completely reverse itself in real time. Jessica's face drained of all color. Michael physically stepped back, his posture shifting rapidly from aggressive arrogance to highly defensive reevaluation. My mother looked like she needed to sit down before she passed out, and my father just stared at me as if he were seeing me for the very first time in my entire life. The emotions flooding my chest were incredibly complicated. There was a definite, fiery satisfaction in seeing their smug faces totally wrecked by shock. I will not deny that, after surviving decades of their neglect and endless condescension, having my worth validated so aggressively in front of them felt incredibly sweet, if only for a fleeting moment. But hiding right beneath that satisfaction was a deep, crushing sadness. It took a massive, public display of extreme wealth and VIP status to get my own family to look at me with a shred of basic human respect. The silent test I had put them through, hoping against hope, they would value me for my heart and my mind had been brutally and unequivocally failed. I broke the silence, keeping my voice perfectly calm and polite. I told them there must have been a simple misunderstanding and stated I would still love to join my father's birthday dinner if I was still welcome. Jessica, utilizing the lightning-fast pivoting skills of a ruthless corporate lawyer, instantly changed her entire personality. She let out a loud, incredibly fake laugh, insisting of course I was welcome. She grabbed my arm affectionately, completely changing her narrative by claiming her earlier comments were just a silly, sarcastic inside joke that had gotten totally out of hand. She aggressively nudged Michael, demanding he back her up. Michael nodded so fast his head nearly spun off. He plastered on a giant, fake smile, completely agreeing with Jessica, loudly declaring that everyone knows how much the Mitchell siblings love to ruthlessly roast each other. My mother had already slithered to my side and tightly linked her arm through mine, pressing against me as if we had been best friends my entire life. She used her sweetest, most sugary country club voice, whining that I absolutely should have told them about my massive tech company, complaining that they had spent years worrying I was struggling. I gently but firmly pulled my arm out of her grip. I looked her dead in the eye and quietly replied that I knew exactly what they thought of me, and that was exactly why I kept my life a secret. Marcus, the manager, clearly sensing the horrific family tension radiating in the hallway, smoothly stepped in and announced the private suite was ready, offering to escort us to our seats. I thanked him politely. As we walked into the dining room, the seating order completely shifted. Instead of being shoved to the back of the line, the staff naturally guided me to the front of the procession. In that short walk, I made a firm decision. I could spend the next 3 hours gloating, throwing their years of cruelty back in their faces, or I could take the high road, for the sake of my own mental peace, and because of the complicated, stubborn love I still harbored for them, I chose the latter. The staff practically floated around us, seating me at the absolute best spot in the room, a chair that directly faced the sprawling, illuminated Chicago skyline. My family filed in behind me in total, unnatural silence. Their endless, exhausting competition to be the center of attention completely evaporated as their brains desperately tried to rewrite everything they thought they knew about their failure of a sister. Once I sat down, I locked eyes with my father across the table. For the first time in over a decade, he was looking at me with intense, genuine interest, completely abandoning the distracted, irritated tolerance he usually reserved for me. I did not know yet if it was actual emotional progress or just a new form of money-driven respect, but it was undeniably a massive change. The private room at the Summit Room was exactly as breathtaking as a billionaire's dining suite should be. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm, flattering glow over the flawlessly set table. The floor-to-ceiling glass offered a mesmerizing view of the city traffic glowing far below. A live string quartet played softly in the corner of the room. My family and the wealthy real estate executives took their seats, and the staff made sure I was seated directly to my father's right, completely abandoning the far end of the table where I was historically banished. Waiters in tailored suits swarmed the table, handing out leather-bound menus and reciting the evening's extravagant specials with perfectly rehearsed elegance. I watched quietly as Jessica strategically practically climbed into the lap of one of my father's richest investors, aggressively slipping back into her networking mode. Michael did the exact same thing on the opposite side of the room. It was painfully clear that old, greedy habits die extremely hard. Once the drinks were poured, Jessica practically yelled across the table to ensure absolutely everyone in the room was listening. She demanded I tell everyone all about my incredible tech startup, lying through her teeth as she proudly declared she had always been my biggest cheerleader. I slowly raised a skeptical eyebrow at her. Barely an hour ago, she had physically used her body to block me from entering the very room we were sitting in. Michael immediately chimed in, aggressively agreeing with Jessica. He lied just as boldly, claiming he always knew my quiet bookstore life was a brilliant, calculated cover story while I built something massive. He let out a loud, booming laugh. Meanwhile, my mother was already aggressively cornering the wife of a wealthy politician seated next to her, confidently spinning an entirely fictional narrative about how she had personally nurtured and funded my entrepreneurial spirit since I was a little girl. She actually claimed I got my ruthless business acumen directly from her, stating she had always pushed me to think outside the box. The entire scene felt like a bizarre fever dream. The exact same people who had just tried to banish me to the lobby bar because my dress was not expensive enough were now violently shoving each other out of the way to bask in the glow of my newly revealed wealth. The absolute hypocrisy of it all would have been hilarious if it did not hurt so much. Throughout the appetizer course, I remained polite but gave incredibly short, factual answers to the endless barrage of questions about learning bridge. Yes, I founded it 5 years ago. Yes, we build adaptive learning software for severely underfunded public school districts. No, I intentionally avoided doing press tours because I wanted the focus on the kids, not on me. As the incredibly elaborate main courses were served, several titans of Chicago business walked over from the main dining room to shake my hand. One was a massive venture capitalist who heavily funded educational tech, and another ran a philanthropic foundation that partnered with Learning Bridge on inner-city projects. Every single time one of these billionaires greeted me with deep respect, I could see Jessica and Michael physically wince, violently jealous of the elite connections I held that they had spent their entire lives desperately trying to forge. During a lull in the chaos, my father finally spoke directly to me. He asked the one question hovering over the entire table, demanding to know why I had kept my life a total secret from my own flesh and blood. It was the very first direct question he had asked me all night. The entire table went dead silent. Everyone, including the business partners, stopped eating and leaned in to hear my answer. I carefully placed my silver fork on my plate and looked around the table at my family's eager, expectant faces. The moment of unavoidable confrontation had finally arrived. Despite my desire to keep things civil, I knew I had to tell them the brutal truth. I looked my father in the eyes and calmly stated that I kept it a secret because my money simply should not matter. I clarified that my bank account should have absolutely zero bearing on how a family treats one another. My mother looked genuinely baffled. She argued that of course it mattered, claiming they would have been incredibly proud of me. I shot back immediately, telling her that was the exact core of the problem. I pointed out that they were only proud of me now because I had finally hit a financial metric they deemed acceptable. I reminded them that for years, while they fully believed I was ringing up paperbacks at a cash register, not a single one of them had ever bothered to ask if I was happy, or showed even a fraction of an ounce of interest in my life. Jessica shifted uncomfortably in her plush velvet chair. She defensively claimed they were just worried about me and wanted me to reach my full potential. I firmly shut her down. I told her they did not want me to reach my potential. They simply wanted me to be exactly like them, pointing out that those are two entirely different concepts. I turned back to my father. I asked him if he remembered when I was 12 years old and won the state creative writing championship. My essay was published in a major magazine, and I had been practically vibrating with excitement to show him. But that exact same afternoon, Jessica's Harvard acceptance letter arrived in the mail. I reminded him that absolutely no one in the family even bothered to show up to my award ceremony. My father stared down at his untouched steak, a dark, heavy shadow of deep guilt passing over his aging face. I did not stop there. I reminded them how I made the dean's list every single semester of my college career, but we never once celebrated it because Michael was in medical school, and my parents deemed that the only real academic achievement worth acknowledging. My mother tried to interrupt again, defensively whining that they just wanted to push me to succeed. I refused to let her control the narrative. I told her flatly that she and Dad taught me from day one that human worth was entirely tied to a very specific, aggressive type of financial success. I reminded them that when I walked away from the miserable corporate world to build something that actually helped impoverished children, they universally treated me like a humiliating burden. The only metric they ever respected was cash and the status that came with it. Jessica's face hardened, her lawyer instincts taking over. She accused me of manipulating them, asking how it was fair that I lied for years, purposefully letting them think I was broke while I secretly built a Silicon Valley-style tech empire. I defended myself instantly. I told her I never lied. I simply chose not to volunteer the information. I explained that I desperately needed to know if my own family could look me in the eye and treat me with basic human decency without needing a bank statement to prove my worth. I told her I just wanted to be loved for the woman I was, not the real estate I owned. Michael aggressively pushed his plate away, arguing that my secret was completely unfair. He claimed I had trapped them in a bizarre psychological test they had no idea they were taking. I conceded that maybe it was a bit unfair, but then I gestured to the hallway and asked him a simple, devastating question. I asked him if he honestly believed we would even be sitting at this table having this conversation if the security guard had not blown my cover. I asked him to look me in the eye and tell me I would not be sitting entirely alone in the lobby bar right now, completely banished from my own father's birthday, simply because my black dress did not have a luxury designer tag on the collar. The agonizing, heavy silence that suffocated the room was the only answer I needed. I looked at my family, taking in their wildly varying reactions. I saw deep defensive anger, intense embarrassment, and, surprisingly, in a few of their eyes, the very first sparks of genuine, painful self-reflection. I let the silence hang for a moment before quietly stating that I was not demanding an apology, and I was absolutely not trying to ruin my father's milestone birthday. I told them I just needed them to finally acknowledge that our family dynamic had been profoundly broken for a very long time, and the events in the hallway made it completely impossible to pretend otherwise. My father rigidly cleared his throat. He looked at me, his eyes shining with unshed tears, and quietly asked if I would walk out to the private terrace with him so we could speak alone. As I stood up from the table, I scanned my siblings' faces. Jessica looked furious and highly defensive, but her eyes were darting around the room, clearly violently rattled by having her entire worldview forcefully challenged. Michael looked incredibly calculated at first, but underneath the LA surgeon bravado, I saw a flicker of the insecure little brother I used to know, a flash of genuine shame I had not seen in decades. My mother just looked completely, utterly lost. Her carefully rehearsed social script had been thrown out the window, and for the first time in my life, she had absolutely no prepared, condescending remark to offer. I followed my father out onto the massive, wind-swept concrete terrace. I had no idea what he was going to say, but for the first time in 20 years, I felt like I was actually about to talk to my dad. Not just the CEO of a real estate firm, the terrace was incredibly quiet, offering a peaceful, chilling contrast to the heavy, suffocating tension inside the dining room. The sprawling grid of Chicago spread out below us like a massive carpet of diamonds against the dark night sky. My father stood gripping the heavy metal railing. He suddenly looked incredibly old, far more fragile and vulnerable than the aggressive titan of industry I was used to dealing with. After a long minute, he quietly admitted he had prepared a massive, boastful speech for the dinner. He said it was supposed to be about his glorious rise from absolute poverty to massive wealth, about the power of relentless hard work. He let out a bitter, self-deprecating laugh, whispering that the entire speech felt completely hollow and worthless now. I stayed quiet, leaning against the railing, giving him the space to process his thoughts. He turned to me, his voice trembling heavily with unshed emotion. He asked me exactly when he had failed me. He begged to know exactly what year he went completely blind and stopped actually seeing his own daughter. The raw, unfiltered vulnerability of his question hit me squarely in the chest, and I felt hot tears threatening to spill over my eyelashes. I told him it was not one specific day. It was a slow, gradual fade. I reminded him of my childhood, of the days he used to preach that a person's character was infinitely more valuable than their bank account. He used to teach me the value of integrity and honesty, but I pointed out that as the massive real estate deals closed, as we moved from a modest house into massive suburban mansions, and as he began running with elite politicians, his entire moral compass shifted. Success stopped meaning being a good person and mutated entirely into hoarding wealth and buying social leverage. My father closed his eyes and nodded slowly. He reminded me that he grew up with absolutely zero safety net. He talked about surviving brutal Detroit winters with no heating in the house, remembering nights where his only dinner was stale bread and the cheapest canned vegetables his waitress mother could afford. He took a ragged, shaky breath. He told me he swore to God his children would never, ever feel the terror of that kind of poverty. He confessed that somewhere along the line, his desperate drive to protect us completely morphed into a toxic, endless addiction to status. I softened my voice. I told him I truly understood his trauma. I told him I knew he wanted to shield us from financial ruin, but by doing so, he had accidentally engineered an entirely different, highly toxic kind of insecurity. I explained that he created an environment where his kids never felt truly loved unless we were actively bringing home trophies, Ivy League degrees, or massive paychecks that he could brag about at the country club. He turned his body completely toward me. He looked me dead in the eye and offered a profound, unreserved apology. He swore it was not an excuse, but he genuinely did not realize what he was doing to us. He let out a wet, shaky laugh, admitting it was a horrific wake-up call to realize the youngest daughter he had spent years feeling deeply embarrassed by was actually the most brilliant and successful person in the entire family. I shook my head firmly. I told him he was still entirely missing the point. I told him the millions of dollars in my company's bank account were not what made me worthy of his love or his respect. He reached out and gently placed a hand on my shoulder. He quietly agreed, stating he finally understood that now. He hesitated for a long time, staring out at the glowing skyline. Finally, he asked me about the highly experimental, $500,000 heart surgery he received after his heart attack, the procedure his premium insurance company had aggressively refused to cover. He looked at me with wide eyes and asked if I was the anonymous donor who paid the hospital bill. I simply nodded. The procedure had cost exactly $500,000, and the second I found out the insurance company denied the claim, I immediately wired the funds through an anonymous corporate trust. He choked back a sob, asking why on earth I did not take the credit for saving his life. I looked at him sadly. I asked him if his massive ego would have ever allowed him to accept life-saving charity from a daughter he genuinely believed was living paycheck to paycheck scanning barcodes at a bookstore. He opened his mouth to argue, realized I was absolutely right, and closed it again. He could not defend himself, and his total silence confirmed everything. Tears finally spilled down my father's weathered cheeks. He told me he desperately wanted to get to know me again. He clarified he did not want to know the millionaire CEO or the real estate mogul, but rather his little girl. He humbly asked if I would ever be willing to give him a second chance. The profound, crushing sincerity in his cracking voice broke down the last of my defensive walls. I wiped a tear from my own cheek and told him I wanted that more than anything. When we finally walked back into the private dining room, the entire energetic frequency of the space had shifted. My father seemed deeply grounded, heavily present, and fully engaged with the people around him, especially me. For the remainder of the lavish meal, he completely ignored his wealthy investors. Instead, he peppered me with questions about my daily life, my software engineers, and my hobbies, listening to my answers with absolute, laser-focused fascination, instead of his usual polite, distracted nodding. After the decadent chocolate birthday cake was served, my mother abruptly stood up and asked me to accompany her to the ladies' room. It was an incredibly transparent, country club-style excuse to get me completely alone. The second the heavy wooden bathroom door clicked shut behind us, my mother completely broke down. Her perfect, incredibly expensive makeup ran down her face as she sobbed, telling me she had absolutely no idea what to say. Confessing she felt like she did not know me at all, I handed her a plush towel and calmly replied, without a drop of malice, that she did not know me because she had never actually tried. I told her she had spent my entire life frantically trying to mold me into a carbon copy of Jessica. My mother aggressively wiped her eyes, smearing expensive mascara across her cheek. She cried out that she just wanted me to have the effortless, privileged life she was entirely denied as a child. She defensively snapped that I had absolutely no idea what it felt like to grow up drowning in social shame, wearing humiliating secondhand clothes, and living in a crumbling house on the wrong side of the railroad tracks. She confessed that the day she married my father, and they finally tasted real money, she made a blood oath that her daughters would never feel inferior to anyone. Looking at her crying in the glaring bathroom lights, I finally saw my mother clearly. For the first time, I did not see the terrifying, polished social climber who terrorized me. I saw the deeply insecure, terrified little girl she used to be, heavily traumatized by poverty, still violently steering the ship decades later. I softened my tone. I told her I truly understood she was trying to protect us from the brutal judgment that had scarred her childhood. But I firmly told her she had to realize she ended up projecting her own massive insecurities directly onto me, ruthlessly punishing me simply because my definition of a good life did not match her rigid, fear-based obsession with status. She leaned against the marble sink and nodded slowly. She admitted that Jessica and Michael were incredibly easy to raise because they hungrily chased the exact same superficial trophies she valued. She looked at me with a completely shattered expression, admitting I had always been entirely different, constantly asking deep, probing questions she was completely unequipped to answer. She took a shaky breath, looked me in the eye, and told me she was profoundly proud of the empire I had built. She quietly sobbed, wishing to God she had been wise enough to figure it out without needing a restaurant manager to humiliate her into seeing the truth. I gave her a sad smile. I told her she never bothered to ask who I was, but I promised her it was not too late to start trying. Our emotional bathroom conversation did not miraculously cure 30 years of toxic mother-daughter trauma, but it broke the ice. I had laid down absolute, titanium boundaries about what kind of behavior I would tolerate moving forward, and for the absolute first time in my life, I truly believed my mother heard me. When we returned to the private suite, the party was winding down. Jessica instantly cornered me near the dessert cart. Her defensive walls were fully raised. She aggressively accused me of secretly judging them all night from my invisible moral high ground. I did not flinch. I fired right back, telling her I had judged her far less than she had openly, verbally judged me to my face in the hallway. She visibly flinched at the reminder. She defensively crossed her arms, firmly stating she was highly successful by any standard on earth and had worked brutal, grueling hours to earn her partnership at the law firm. I calmly agreed with her. I told her I never once doubted her incredible work ethic. I explained that my only issue was that she viciously judged my worth entirely by my lack of designer labels. I added a little dark humor, jokingly referring to myself as the undercover millionaire. Jessica's aggressive posture faltered. Her voice lost its sharp, corporate edge. I leaned in and told her the amount of money in my investment accounts was entirely irrelevant. I pointed out that even when she fully believed I was barely scraping by, she could have easily treated me with basic sisterly respect. She could have celebrated the fact that I was happy doing quiet work I loved. Instead, I told her, she treated my very existence like a toxic public relations crisis she had to manage. Jessica stared at the floor, chewing her perfectly painted lip as she absorbed the brutal honesty. Finally, she looked up, her eyes bright with tears, and confessed something that completely shocked me. She admitted she was violently jealous of me. She said the confession tasted like ash in her mouth, but she admitted she was jealous of me even when she truly believed I was just a broke bookstore clerk. I stared at her in total confusion, asking what on earth she could possibly be jealous of. She let out a bitter, exhausted sigh. She told me I always looked so deeply content and completely free, explaining she had never felt a single moment of peace in her entire life. She looked me in the eye and asked if I had any idea how soul-crushing it was to work 80 hours a week at a high-pressure law firm she absolutely despised, purely because she was paralyzed by the overwhelming terror of disappointing the family if she admitted she hated her life. It was an earth-shattering moment of raw, unguarded vulnerability from the sister I had spent my life thinking was an emotionless robot. I asked her softly why she did not just quit and find a job she actually liked. She let out a hollow, defeated laugh, asking what else she was supposed to do, claiming the ruthless corporate lawyer persona was the only identity she had left. I grabbed her hand. I told her firmly that it is literally never too late to completely rewrite your own life. Like with my parents, our brief conversation was not a magical, instant fix for decades of brutal sibling rivalry, but it was the very first time we had spoken to each other like actual human beings. Jessica's defensive instincts were deeply hardwired into her brain, but I finally saw massive cracks in her icy armor. I saw a tiny glimpse of the sweet older sister I vaguely remembered from our early childhood, before getting straight A's and securing high society approval became her entire religion. As the waiters began clearing the tables and the evening officially drew to a close, Michael awkwardly shuffled over to me. He nervously rubbed the back of his neck, completely stripped of his usual arrogant Beverly Hills swagger. He let out a self-deprecating chuckle, noting the brutal irony that while he spent the last 5 years aggressively bragging about leasing sports cars and injecting Botox into D-list celebrities, I was quietly building something that actually changed the world. He actually admitted it out loud with a shocking level of self-awareness. I offered him a gentle olive branch. I told him his medical degree was incredibly valuable, reminding him that helping people regain their confidence was not entirely worthless. He heavily shrugged his shoulders. He bluntly admitted that while a tiny fraction of his work helped people, 90% of his practice was pure, unadulterated vanity, and he knew it. He stared at his expensive Italian shoes and confessed he had not performed a single surgery based on actual medical necessity in over 7 years. He looked up at me with genuine, boyish curiosity. He quietly asked if I was actually happy with my quiet, secretive life and the massive company I built. The absolute sincerity of the question completely caught me off guard, especially coming from Michael. I smiled warmly and told him that, on most days, I was incredibly happy. I admitted running a massive tech company was exhausting and incredibly difficult, but the mission kept me entirely fulfilled. He nodded slowly, his eyes distant. He whispered that he honestly did not know if he could say the same thing about himself. He confessed he had spent so many years frantically chasing the next massive paycheck and the next flashy status symbol that he had completely lost track of what actually brought him joy. He let out a sad, highly critical laugh, calling his own life completely pathetic. I shook my head firmly. I told him it was not pathetic at all, but incredibly human. I reminded him that absolutely everyone falls into the trap of seeking outside validation from time to time. He offered a sad, crooked smile, agreeing that some of us just fall into the trap a lot harder than others. As my father paid the massive bill and everyone began grabbing their coats, I looked at my family through an entirely new lens. They were still deeply flawed. They were still heavily burdened by the intense, suffocating status anxiety that had poisoned our relationships for decades. But the explosive events of the evening had violently ripped off their masks, exposing a raw, painful truth that finally created a tiny window for real, authentic healing, provided we were all brave enough to actually do the work. Right before we stepped into the elevators to leave the skyscraper, I formally invited my entire family to come tour Learning Bridge's corporate headquarters the following week. To my absolute shock, every single one of them immediately agreed to come. The private tour of my tech company was a massive revelation for them. They finally got to see me operating entirely in my element, confidently leading a massive team of brilliant software engineers and dedicated educators who deeply respected me for my vision, not my bank account. They walked through our cutting-edge development labs, watching programmers write code that adapted to the specific needs of learning-disabled children. They sat quietly and listened to glowing video testimonials from grateful public school teachers working in deeply impoverished neighborhoods, proudly explaining how our software had doubled their students' math and reading scores. But the thing that impacted my family the most was walking them through the massive philanthropic foundation my company funded. I showed them photographs of the modern schools we fully funded and built in developing nations. I showed them the massive college scholarship funds we set up for brilliant teenagers trapped in the foster care system, and the aggressive training initiatives we launched to keep great teachers in struggling inner-city districts. I did not show them the charitable foundation to brag about my wealth. I deliberately showed them all of this, to forcefully redefine what true, meaningful success actually looked like in my eyes, completely rejecting their shallow metrics. And slowly, step by step, I saw genuine evidence that they were actually trying to unlearn their toxic habits. 6 months have passed since that incredibly dramatic birthday dinner, and the dynamic within my family has drastically shifted. The massive transformation was not instantaneous, and it certainly was not magical, but it was absolutely real and required daily effort. My father shocked me the most. Just a few weeks after touring Learning Bridge, he completely restructured his schedule and launched a massive, fully funded mentorship program for minority entrepreneurs trying to build businesses in underserved communities. He started heavily leveraging his massive network of cutthroat investors to secure funding for kids who grew up fighting the exact same brutal poverty he had survived. He calls me twice a week now. Sometimes he calls to ask for my advice on scaling his charity program. But most of the time, he calls just to chat, finally giving me the deep, meaningful father-daughter conversations I had been intensely craving for 20 years. During a recent lunch date, he reached across the table and told me his definition of success had been entirely broken. He admitted that watching me lead my team and seeing the actual, tangible good I put into the world forced him to completely reevaluate his entire legacy. My mother's personal growth has been much slower and faced a lot more internal resistance. Decades of obsessive social climbing and country club politics are incredibly difficult to rewire, but even she is making genuine strides. She quietly started volunteering 2 days a week at an underfunded youth community center in a neighborhood she previously would have locked her car doors while driving through. Initially, I know she only took the volunteer gig as a desperate, calculated move to win back my approval under our new family dynamic. But over the last few months, I have noticed a massive shift. When she talks about the struggling teenagers she mentors there, her voice holds zero pity or condescension. She speaks about them with deep, genuine respect and fierce protective energy. Jessica, remaining as fiercely pragmatic and highly intense as ever, found a brilliant way to merge her cutthroat corporate skills with actual morality without giving up her massive corner office. She aggressively bullied her law firm into letting her take on massive, high-profile pro bono civil rights cases, utilizing her Ivy League legal brain to aggressively fight for marginalized students who had been wronged by the system. It perfectly fed her highly competitive nature, but actively weaponized her aggression against massive, corrupt institutions instead of her own family. During one of our newly established monthly sister dinners, she drained a glass of wine and admitted she was still working insane, grueling hours, but confessed that for the first time in her entire legal career, she was actually sleeping perfectly at night because she was finally doing something that genuinely mattered. Michael underwent arguably the most extreme personal transformation. After weeks of intense soul-searching, he aggressively completely overhauled his entire Beverly Hills medical practice. He slashed his cosmetic celebrity work and dedicated 60% of his operating schedule to performing incredibly complex, heavily discounted reconstructive surgeries for victims of horrific domestic violence and massive car accidents. He still kept a few wealthy cosmetic clients to keep the lights on, but his entire moral center of gravity had radically shifted. He called me late one night, sounding exhausted but incredibly peaceful. He told me he had entirely forgotten why he went to medical school in the first place. He admitted it was never supposed to be about buying luxury cars. He originally just wanted to help broken people feel whole again. As for me, my own internal healing process is still highly active. The brutal, agonizing pain of being publicly rejected by my own family in that restaurant hallway left deep, permanent scars on my heart. I absolutely cannot deny that. There are still dark, quiet moments where my anxiety flares up, and I genuinely question if my family actually loves Sarah the person, or if they just finally learned to respect Sarah the tech billionaire. Family dynamics are incredibly messy, deeply layered, heavily weighed down by decades of toxic history, and they simply do not magically fix themselves overnight. But I am actively learning to find total, unshakable peace within myself, fiercely validating my own life choices, without needing a single drop of their approval. The brutal truth is, I had to violently confront my own hypocrisy. I had not been entirely honest with myself about why I kept my massive success a secret for so many years. Yes, I desperately wanted them to love me for my heart. But if I am being totally honest, I was also actively using the massive secret as a bulletproof shield, completely terrified of making myself vulnerable, using my hidden wealth to protect myself from the crushing agony of their inevitable rejection. Today, I am forcing myself to be entirely authentic with them. I share my massive corporate victories, but I also openly share my crushing anxieties and daily struggles, actively allowing them to see the messy, highly complicated woman I actually am. Sometimes they handle my vulnerability beautifully, and sometimes they aggressively slip right back into their old, toxic habits. We are all actively a work in progress. Our loud, chaotic family dinners, which historically served as deeply toxic battlegrounds for bragging about promotions and luxury purchases, are slowly transforming into places of actual connection. There are absolutely still moments of sharp tension and massive misunderstandings, but those are now heavily mixed with genuine laughter, raw vulnerability, and a slowly growing capacity to actually see and radically accept each other for who we truly are. Learning Bridge continues to massively expand. We recently launched an aggressive global initiative entirely dedicated to providing adapted educational tablets to children trapped in international refugee camps, ensuring that completely displaced kids do not lose their fundamental right to learn. I am more intensely obsessed than ever with engineering massive opportunities for kids who were dealt a terrible hand in life. My father and I have even officially partnered up, legally merging his massive real estate connections with my software engineering teams to build fully modernized, tech-enabled community centers in Chicago's poorest neighborhoods. It is a massive, beautiful collaboration that neither of us could have ever possibly imagined a year ago. The ultimate, overriding lesson I learned from this entire chaotic nightmare is that human worth absolutely cannot be measured by a bank account, a job title, or elite social status. True worth is built entirely on having unbreakable integrity, aggressively living by your own moral code, and desperately fighting to leave the world just a little bit better than you found it. I learned the hard way that achieving massive financial success by sacrificing your own soul and destroying your family is just a highly expensive form of total failure. I also learned the incredibly hopeful truth that people are actually capable of massive, radical change, even after decades of being completely paralyzed by toxic habits. My family is still incredibly far from perfect, and maintaining our new, fragile dynamic requires absolutely exhausting daily effort and constant, aggressive boundary setting. But the incredible progress we have made proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that it is literally never too late to tear down a toxic foundation and build something radically authentic and deeply beautiful in its place. That horrifying evening at the summit room, the exact moment my family aggressively tried to banish me into the shadows because my dress did not cost enough money, was not the tragic end of our family. It was the explosive, violent catalyst we desperately needed. It brutally forced every single one of us to look in the mirror. And despite the agonizing pain, it cleared the rotting debris away, creating the exact space we needed to finally grow. Sometimes, the universe has to completely burn your life to the ground so you can build something vastly superior in the ashes. Looking back at that night and the chaotic, beautiful months that followed, I fully realized that living authentically will always ruthlessly expose who actually belongs in your life. When you demand the truth, some relationships will naturally deepen into something unbreakable, while others will violently shatter and fall away. And honestly, that is exactly what is supposed to happen. The few bonds that survive the fire of absolute honesty, built entirely on mutual respect, are the only ones actually worth keeping. Has your own family ever brutally judged you based on shallow, superficial metrics? Have you ever had to aggressively fight to defend your own personal definition of what actually matters in this world? Tell me your story in the comments section below. If my chaotic journey from total rejection to genuine healing resonated with your soul, hit the like button and subscribe so you never miss a new story about radical personal growth and surviving toxic family dynamics. Thank you so much for listening. And please always remember, your fundamental value as a human being is never, ever defined by the incredibly narrow, fear-based limitations of how other people view success.